Hello and welcome back to Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we are going through the famous book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games in that book one at a time and looking at Reti's analysis of those games. This is game number 26 in the book, and it is the second game of Emanuel Lasker, the second world champion. Lasker has the white pieces and his opponent is William Napier, who has the black pieces. Now here we see Lasker play e5 and Napier responds with c5. We have our first Sicilian defence. Now here Reti offers a little bit of analysis into the Sicilian, but although not as much as he does for most openings. He says that after white has pushed d4, after some preparation, let's just say they go for this variation, that black will have exchanged the c-pawn for the d-pawn. So we'll potentially be able to get quite a strong and dominant centre. However, white currently has this space advantage, and black's position will often be a little bit more crowded, and black will have a bit less space. And the game is very open, which means that black is often going to be the one who is defending an attack. However, black's superior pawn structure means that if it gets to an endgame, black will stand better chances, which is why most games in the Sicilian, if they're short, they're usually won by white, and if they are won, they're usually won by black. So if they are longer, they're usually won by black. At least that was Reti's analysis. So we have c5. Now here we have knight to c3. The main line is knight f3 first. And now we have knight to c6. And next knight f3. Now usually white will play the knight to f3 on a second move and push d4. Although after knight f3, white can still push d4 now, and it's not going to make a huge amount of difference. However, after knight c3, white is also keeping in reserve the potential option of pushing g3 and going for a potential closed Sicilian with a bishop on g2, potentially a pawn on d3, and you may push f4 at some later point. It's important to note that knight c3 is necessary to play this g3 move, because in most Sicilians, black wants to get this d5 pawn push in, and the knight on c3 defends this d5 square. It's why you'll often see some people play f4 going into what they think is a Grand Prix, but this allows the potential of d5, which can sometimes give black a bit more of an advantage. It's why the Grand Prix would usually start off with knight c3 followed by f4, because knight c3 first of all defends this d5 square. And it's the same here. If white chose to go g3 now, then d5 is a potential option, and this is actually a lot stronger than we saw with f5. Sorry, with f4 first. After queen takes d5, we've got this attack on the rook, which needs to be defended, but white's going to come into a bit of bother quite quickly. However, we don't see the closed Sicilian, although Reti does comment on it, which is why I wanted to mention it. We see knight to f3, and then g6. Now, Reti comments that this g6 variation is quite common. It's often in line with black's plan. The bishop on g7 will add more pressure to this d4 square, and we note that black's adding quite a lot of pressure to this square currently. And but Reti does comment that something like d6 may be a potential alternative. It's a bit more solid. It sort of keeps the center a bit more solid as well. But we see g6, so going into almost like a dragon formation. d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop to g7, bishop to e3, d6, and now we have h3. This is obviously quite a rare move, and probably is a mistake. Objectively, it's not the best move. So we've got here a dragon Sicilian. So usually in this position, you would normally play queen d2, potentially f3, and castle long, and you'd very often go for like that's a Yugoslav attack. Queen d2. So this is a sort of Yugoslav attack. You may have a bishop on c4, you sometimes drop it back to b3. You may not, you may start pushing your pawns now instead. But that's the Yugoslav attack. And that's what we'd usually see. Reti also comments that bishop e2 is a commonly played move. However, I don't think it's played that often against this Sicilian setup. I don't think it's played that often at all anymore. But instead we see h3. And Lasker intends to try and start an attack on the king side by h3, g4, possibly even f4. Now Lasker has achieved this attack, and it has been successful with it a few times. However, Reti does comment that this attack is premature. The centre is still in dispute. White's king is still in the centre as well. White hasn't finished development. This attack isn't ready. It's premature. So it does violate a lot of the principles of chess. And I think it's important to note that Lasker doesn't disagree with the principles of chess. He doesn't disagree that this violates the principles and it may not be objectively the best way forward. Indeed, in a book which Lasker wrote himself, he talks about an attack on the flank only being possible once it's sufficiently prepared. However, Reti comments that he thinks that this h3 and potential g4 push, this early attack on the king side, isn't necessarily about playing objectively the best moves or the most principled moves, but is perhaps more psychological in nature. His opponent would have got into the Sicilian defence knowing what to expect. He would have known what sort of game to expect after the g3 goes Sicilian. He'd have known what to expect after the Alapin or this, or if we went into like something like this Yugoslav attack setup. But with this, his opponent immediately has to change his plans, and this can be a bit difficult for his opponent to do, I think. And it also means his opponent has to think for himself. Now here, Reti comments that if White's going for this premature attack, then his opponent is probably better off playing sound principled moves, developing, castling the king, and then striking in the centre. Because you meet an attack on the flank with a counter-attack in the centre. But equally, you probably don't want to open up the centre whilst your king is in the middle of the board. So that's Black's current plan. His plan before may have been to defend and get into a favourable endgame, but now his plan has to be to simply castle and attack in the centre himself, which is very different to what he initially planned to do at the start, which is the psychological reasoning, I think, that Reti talks about. It's a psychological reasoning for this early h3 g4 push. Not the most sound move, but perhaps enough to win the game psychologically. Now here we see knight f6, g4, castles, and Reti comments again that White is throwing everything he's got at Black's king side, but Black continues to follow the sound principles of chess. And now Black's king is out of the way of the centre, so now Black needs to consider striking in the centre. and he should only strike in the centre once his king is out of the centre itself. Now we see g5, knight e8, h4, knight to c7, f4, now e5. This is the counter-attack in the centre. We see knight d to e2 and d5. And Reti described this as an error. He describes it as a bit of a miscalculation, a bit of a nervous error that potentially occurred because the opponent was sort of put off. Black is sacrificing a pawn in an attempt to force open the centre. However, the variation which we see, it's likely that Black just didn't quite calculate quite far enough ahead, even though he did probably calculate very far anyway. We see e takes d4. Then we see knight to d4. Knight to d4. Knight takes d4. It's worth noting after this knight to d4, if it was bishop takes d4, e takes d4, knight takes d4, knight takes d5, and Reti comments that this is just better for Black because White's structure is potentially just ruined. So White's quite far behind in development. The queen's on the board, the king's in the centre, and his structure is just ruined. So that's why we don't see bishop take. We don't see bishop takes. We instead see knight takes d4. Now we see knight takes d5 and knight to f5, which is a nice little continuation actually. Now, Lasker, just in making this move, Reti comments that Napier very likely saw this move since he would have been otherwise losing a piece. You know, if we saw something like, say, knight takes d5 instead, e takes d4, and now Reti comments that Black is just clearly ahead. If we take here, we just lose the piece. Obviously, we can't take the queen. We're a bit stuck really. Queen f3 is probably the best bet, but even then, something like this is a potential option. Although the computer's giving long castle, which I didn't actually see. So bishop to e6 is a computer's move here, which makes sense. Bishop to c4. Anyway, I'm not going to get into the computer line. In this position, this is as far as Reti now has analysed, saying that Black is clearly better here. Now in the game we see knight to f5. Note that taking this knight, let's say with the pawn, let's say with the bishop, say ruining this pawn structure, that would give queen takes d5, and then after e takes e4, queen takes d8, rook takes d8, bishop takes f4, and White's ahead now. White's a piece up. So taking this knight isn't really an option. So instead we see knight takes c3. I think the other variation given is... oh no, sorry. I think that's all of them. So we have knight takes c3 in the game, and queen takes d8, rook takes d8, and now knight to e7. And Reti comments that it's not clear just how far ahead Black saw. However, neither this move or the next move can gain a material advantage for White. So Black may well have seen this, so it's not too clear. Yes, important to note, instead of knight takes g7 is a potential alternative as well. After which knight to d5, long castle pinning the knight, and then bishop to g4, and Reti comments that Black's now probably still got the advantage here. In fact, the computer just recommends giving up the exchange, but then after bishop c4, rook d8. Yeah, so the computer just recommends giving up the exchange. So they were the two black moves that were potential options: knight takes g7 and knight takes e7. Sorry, knight to e7 check. We see knight to e7 check, and this knight is going to be essentially deciding the game later on. It's quite interesting. So we see king to h8, and it's important to note the knight here still can't be taken. After bishop takes c4, e takes f4, bishop to d4, bishop takes d4, c takes d4, and rook to e8. Black has the advantage because this knight is currently pinned, and black's structure is a little bit better. As 4 pawns to 2 here, black's probably got the better endgame here. So after king h8, this knight still can't be taken. However, we see h5, and Reti comments that Lasker had a very good understanding of positions like this. The knight is supposedly en prise, but Lasker is focused on the king side. He's focused on his attack, and this is where Lasker is clearly better. So this is where he's focusing. Now, if instead of here we had knight takes c8, we would still have something like knight to d5, and this game was, and this is a variation given by Reti, where White is supposedly meant to save himself because this knight is trapped. However, I think Reti may have overlooked this long castling move, because after takes here, bishop takes a7. White's a little bit better here. Takes here, and the material's equal. There's 3 pawns against 1, but White has the bishop pair. I can't connect. White has a bishop pair, and has 4 against 2 here. So White's probably a little bit better in this endgame. However, there's still quite a bit of playing to do. Yeah, so Reti only actually analysed up until knight to d5, where he said that black is able to save himself with this move. However, long castle wins the game for White, well, gives White a better position. So we've looked at what happens after b takes c3, and we've looked at what happens after knight takes c8. In the game we saw h5. As I said, Lasker is continuing his attack on the king side. This is where he's better. We see rook to e8 attacking the knight, and potentially after this move there's going to be a very long pin. It's worth noting h5, what the threat is. After a6, something like h takes g6, threatening mate in 1. F takes g6 is forced, this pawn is obviously pinned, and knight takes g6 check, king to g8, bishop to c4 check, knight to d4, sorry, knight to d5, bishop takes, rook takes, and then knight to e7 would win the rook. So that's the threat after h5 of taking here, and after all of the exchanges and the check and the checks, and these 2 checks here, White would just be White will win the rook by the fork. So Napier saw this and played rook to e8, setting up this pin. And now we see bishop to c5. So he's sort of maintaining this the threat that he had last move. Now here we see g takes h5. If we saw something like e takes f4, so pinning the knight to the king, so this check is no longer really possible. We'd still see this h takes g6 motive. After f takes g6, bishop to c4, and now the threat is bishop to f7. So the threat is bishop f7 here, and if the rook just moves, it's game over. It's checkmate, because the pawn is pinned, the knight's checking, and the king can't move. So this bishop f7 move is almost certainly going to pick up at least the rook. So I was after bishop to c5. Now here we have e takes f. So we don't have that. We have g takes h5, which is perhaps a more surprising move. E takes f4 is obviously the more logical continuation, but it does have the refutation of bishop c4 taking on f7. Now, after this g takes h5, Reti comments that white's task is a bit more difficult. The knight still can't be taken here. It's been on pre for a very long time, but it still can't be taken. Let's have a look and see what happen if we do take it. So b takes c3, then would have something like bishop to f8, pinning the knight to the bishop. Bishop to b5, attacking the rook. Rook takes e7, bishop takes e7, bishop takes e7. And now Reti comments that although black is down the exchange, black would likely have the more favourable endgame due to the potentially better pawn structure and the bishop pair. Now, interestingly, the computer does prefer white in this endgame. So I would assume that perhaps, although black's endgame may be a bit easier to play, with the best moves, even if they're difficult to find, it will be white who would win. So that's what would happen after we take here. This little variation here, where black wins where black loses the exchange but gets to a easier to play endgame. So instead of taking the knight, we have bishop to c4. Now e takes f4, and now this knight is pinned. Interestingly, Reti does comment that if black tries to play a bit more defensively, this position can lead to a bit more of an equal endgame, which may have been black's better choice. So after bishop to e6, bishop takes, f takes, and now b takes c3, bishop to f8, rook takes h5, bishop takes, rook takes, f takes e5, rook to c8, and long castles. This is a variation given by Reti. So Reti comments that this endgame is favourable for white, and the computer would agree with that. It gives plus 0.4 for white. However, with there being still two rooks on the board, and white is up a pawn, but one of them is doubled here, and the pawn structure perhaps isn't too good for white. It's very likely to still end up as a draw in this position, even though it's more favourable for white, but a draw is still very likely. So this move may have been black's best shot, but we don't see bishop e6, we see e takes f6, and here Napier is trying to get a counter-attack at all cost. Bishop to e, so this e takes f4 opens up the rook to the king, pinning the knight to the king. And now we see bishop takes f7, attacking the rook, and now knight to e4. And now black is sacrificing this rook, which Reti comments that this sacrifice, it is losing. However, it's likely Napier's best chance at trying to win the game, because it creates a lot of very difficult to navigate complications. Now here we see bishop takes e8, bishop takes b2, rook to b1, bishop to c3, check, king f1, and now bishop to g4. And now white is a rook up, well, a rook for 2 pawns up. However, black has a lot of counterplay here. So black's got quite a few threats. There's knight to d2, forking the king and the rook. There's knight to g3, forking the king and the rook. There's knight takes f5. And there is rook takes e8, which will then also attack the knight. So, and white's king is exceptionally exposed. Black's king is exposed, but nowhere near as exposed. And it seems that white's attack has sort of petered out. However, white can, if white's able to continue this king's head attack, which they are, then white can get the decisive advantage. Now in the game we see bishop takes h5, removing the bishop from the way of the rook. We see bishop takes h5, and notice how Lasker gives back the material. He gives back the material to get this open h file, so this pawn is still pinned, and this is so he can continue his attack. You see rook takes h5, knight to g3, king to g2, knight takes here, and rook takes b7. And now after a5, because rook takes a7 was perhaps threatened, or bishop takes a7, we see rook to b3, attacking the bishop, bishop to g7, rook to h3, reclaiming this open file. And note how after all those complications, material is equal. We now have knight to g3, now king to f3, and Reti comments that this king move is the first success in white's position now. So black's f-pawn can't be protected, since both bishop e5 and rook to f8 lose to this fork. And if the rook was on f8, it would also be forked. So this pawn can't be protected. So this is the first success in white's position. So here we see instead rook to a6, king takes f4. Now the knight's under threat, so we see knight to e2 check, king to f5. We see knight to c3, a3, moving the pawn out of the way of the knight. Knight to a4, attacking the bishop. Bishop to e3. And in this position, I believe black resigned. Although I have seen a couple of games, I've seen 2 versions of this game, one where he resigned now and one where the game continued for a few more moves. Now the threat is g6, which would lead to a mate in 1. If we just have something like this, after g6, the threat is just rook takes h7 mate. And yes, you can continue with something like h6, but it's still a mate. You know, bishop takes h6 here, bishop takes, rook takes here, check, king to here, rook to here, king f8, and then something like king g7 check, and you're going to get another queen. And it's a discovered attack as well. So that's why in this position, at least in the book by Reti, it says that black resigned, because this g6 move, there's no good counter to it. Of course, if you play, well, the rook's on pre, but if you play g6, you can't just take it because you'll lose the rook, because the pawn is pinned. So there we have it. That was game number 26, and quite an interesting game actually. We saw how Lasker actually violated a lot of the principles of chess, and realistically probably was wasn't right to do so. Probably if he was against a stronger player who wasn't afraid of this kingside attack, who was able to respond to it in perhaps a more effective way, then Lasker may well have lost this game because of that. However, like Reti commented, a lot of Lasker's play is based upon the psychology of his opponent. He will play according to the opponent's weaknesses, which may be that the opponent may not be able to respond well to unprincipled early pushes like this. And so there we have it. That was game number 26, the second game of Lasker. Quite a different game than usual. And I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did enjoy it, please like, comment and subscribe. And I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching.